You're up and running.
Oh, okay. Do I need a mic or just this?
I'm not saying I enjoyed it, but it's been beneficial. I didn't need to go up there and do this alone and stuff. I said, I went on field and my daughter-in-law. They had stuff in her garage. And I just told them, just get around. You know,
Well, I have 6:15. And for the sake of those that are online with us, we start at 6:15 and end about 7:15. And welcome to those of you who have joined us online. I can't see you, but I can hear you breathing. This is the first session of the Prayer-Shaped Disciple, postponed twice. The last 2 Wednesdays we were supposed to start, and we had weather and road conditions and so forth, so finally we're getting it started. These sessions come from the notes that I used to teach the course on prayer at Southwestern Baptist Seminary for 22 years, give or take a little, and various places around the globe I went to teach, and some churches. So I've used them in a lot of different settings, and it comes from the textbook that I eventually wrote for the course called The Prayer-Shaped Disciple. That's where the title comes from. The book is out of print. I had someone ask me on Facebook today, is it available anywhere? And I said, well, probably Amazon.com, you could get a copy. And about 30 minutes later, she posted back on Facebook. She said, I looked it up, and there's one copy available for $55. I got short-changed on my royalties on that deal. But then I looked on some other sites that have used books, and $7.79, I think, was the going rate for a used copy. And if I'm not mistaken, the original book when it came out was $12.95. I may be off $1 or $2 on that, but that's the book. Now, the good news is if you want to read the book, you can go online to my website, which is discipleallnations.org, and up in the top menu thing, it says free ebooks. And this one, along with everything else I've written that's out of print, has been scanned into there. So you get the whole book free. Just don't click print, because you're going to print a lot of pages unless you know how to turn off your print button. Anyway, that's the book. Now, you deserve at least an explanation as to where that funny title came from, Prayer-Shaped Disciple. I had written an earlier book for a discipleship course called Disciple Shape, subtitle 12 Weeks to Spiritual Fitness. And that title came from our son graduating from Marine Boot Camp in San Diego. And the graduation ceremony began when the commander-in-chief said, "These young men and women are in the finest physical shape of their lives." Well, I had seen them at the airport when they left, and most of them were like our son. They're a little overweight, and not quite in good physical shape yet, but in 12 weeks they were, and they all looked alike, and they're all slim, what was it, lean, mean fighting machines. But it started me to thinking, in 12 weeks you can get in great physical shape. What would it take to get in great spiritual shape in 12 weeks? And so I had a title for that book, Disciple Shape, 12 Weeks to Spiritual Fitness. I wish I could retitle it and do it over. I would have said 12 Weeks Toward Spiritual Fitness, because it gives the impression you could be spiritually fit in 12 weeks, which you can't, because it's a lifetime process. Anyway, the publisher liked it, and it sold well because students had to buy it, and they took the course, and said, "You need to write another book, but try to tie it into the title." Okay, so the book was basically written, and I still didn't have a title. I'm trying to figure out, what do I call this book where it fits this title? And I went on a 3-week around-the-world prayer journey with the International Mission Board. We went through China, and then to India, and then to Yemen, and then out through Western Europe. 3 weeks. Basically hitting the 3 major world religions of Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam. I'd only been back a week or so. I was in some group somewhere, and somebody said, "Have you met Dr. Crawford?" Said, "He just got back from prayer walking around the world." And this guy with a IQ about the same as a rubber duck, I think, said, "Wow, he must be in good shape." And so the other one said, "Well, he didn't walk around the world. They flew and they prayer walked, and then they flew somewhere and prayer walked." He says, "Well, I guess then we'd have to say he's in prayer shape." Well, there's your title, The Prayer-Shaped Disciple. And it fit the publisher's idea of tying it into the first book and so forth. So that's how we got the title. And I just keep the title because it's a part of the outline, and beyond me explaining the title, we don't have much to say about the prayer-shaped disciple, except it fits the outline, and so we'll go with that. The idea of prayer and studying prayer and being involved in prayer has intensified greatly. When I joined the faculty at Southwestern Seminary in 1985 and quickly inherited the course on prayer because the missionary who was teaching it got sick, and I made a rookie mistake that I learned from and asked a question in a faculty meeting. And I said, "Who's going to finish that course for him?" And everybody looked at me. And so I inherited the course just like that. At that point, there were, according to my research, 70 identifiable prayer ministries in the United States, where you could say this primary purpose of this organization is to promote prayer. Some of it was in schools, some of it was in churches, some of it was just parachurch, but identifiable organizations. When I retired in 2007, 22 years later, shortly before that, I got a directory in the mail of prayer ministries in the United States. It was 70 pages long, and each page had probably 5 or 6 ministries on it by the time I give a title and website and director and phone number and so forth. Maybe 5 or 6 per page. So, you went from 70 to 70 pages, which might have been 350 to 400 prayer ministries in 22 years. So that's one other measuring thing. When these markers that you get as you get older, when you get your AARP card, And that's a pretty traumatic day. And I got one of these that says, you have been invited to be a senior advisor to the American National Prayer Committee. And I think I was 55 or something. Senior advisor. So I took it and I went, and there might have been 24 people. They meet twice a year. One of the good meetings, there might have been 24 people. The last meeting I went to, which was a year ago now, before the COVID travel things kicked in, winter meetings are always in a warm place, and the spring meetings are in Washington, D.C. with the National Day of Prayer. This was Sarasota, Florida, and we had about 200 people there. So from 20 or 24 around a big table to 200 or so. That's the interest level that has gone up over the last few years. So prayer. Now here's, I'm just kind of going over some ground rules here to get us into this. Questions and answers are always appropriate. I didn't survive the classroom that long without understanding the value of that. So please feel free to ask a question. I'll probably repeat it so those that are online can be sure and hear the question. And then I'll try to answer it or move on to the next question or assign you to research it and come back next week with the answer. Good teaching method. So feel free to ask questions. Now, those of you online, we do not have a way by which you can ask me a question tonight. We may have that up sometime in the future. But if you know somebody that's here and you text them a question, maybe they can ask me the question. Or if you'll write it down and then lose it, I'll give you my cell number. And you can text me. If you understand that I won't be able to answer the question immediately because I'm not looking at my cell phone. But we'll pause every now and then and I'll see if anybody's had a question. So if you're ready to write it down, here it is, my cell number, and you can text me a question if you're online, or if you plan to be online next week or whatever. You can write it down now. 817-637-4967. One more time. 817-637-4967. I've already gotten one text message today that says, I love you, and it was a name about that long, and where did that come from? My wife got one on her cell phone, same thing. So somebody in the world, likely in Pakistan, from the looks of the name, somebody loves me. That's nice to know. So we have come from early days of prayer ministries. Or if you want to do it biblically, we've come from the conversation in the garden, Adam, where are you? All the way to what has been described as the golden age of communication. We've got more communication going on these days than ever before in history. And, means of communication, everything from text messaging to FaceTime to a year ago, I'd not heard the word Zoom, and now I'm on it 3 or 4 times a week. Golden age of communication. In fact, so much so that God now has a fax number. I don't have it written here. I'd give it to you. But I had students that would actually call it. The Bezek telephone system in Jerusalem, their office is located across the square from the Wailing Wall. And you can fax a prayer request to this number, and they'll get it in that Bezek phone company. And supposedly write it down or print it off and take it across the square and put it in the Wailing Wall. So if that is something you would feel beneficial about, you can fax God. Now, I'm not sure about whether God gets that or not, but nevertheless, I guess it makes some people feel good that God now has a fax number. So that's how far we've come. Interesting then that, not surprising, with that kind of increase in interest that a course at the seminary level on prayer would gain in popularity, and it did. I don't even remember what we started with, but I remember along the way them closing the class with 50 in it each semester, and a few semesters where I had 2 sections with 50 each. We had larger enrollments back then, I understand that too, but nevertheless, there was a great deal of interest in that subject, and a lot of interest in what in the world do you do in there after the first day. You know, when you teach people how to say, "Dear Lord," and go through acts, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, and in Jesus' name, amen, now what are you going to do? And those students who were asking those kind of questions would get to the end of the semester saying, is there an advanced course? Is there more of this? So, interest level was pretty high. Unfortunately, the chair of prayer at Southwestern Baptist Seminary ceased to exist when I retired. It is no longer there. I'm not sure where the money went. I have a theory. But no one was given that chair, and no one has taught that course since my retirement. And coming up in April, the new president of Southwestern Seminary, Dr. Adam Greenway, one of my former students, will be preaching here. And you can all ask him that question. Line up one at a time and ask him when he's going to reinstate the chair of prayer, because he promises me it will be reinstated, but the money's gone. It takes $500,000 to endow a chair in an institution, and that money's gone. So he says whenever somebody gives $500,000, we will reinstitute the chair of prayer and start teaching that course again. Trivia. Okay, the prayer-shaped disciple prays with a reason. I guess now would be a good time to say any questions before I get into point 1. I've just kind of been introducing the whole idea. Any questions here, or if you're online, you can text one in. Okay. Prayer-shaped disciple prays with a reason. This is the why question. Why pray? I went to speak to a missionary group in Burkina Faso, West Africa. And I was to address their annual meeting of the missionaries in that part of West Africa. I was to address that meeting on the subject of prayer. And I think it was 3 times during their conference. Anyway, first meeting. I hadn't gotten the first sentence out, and the hand went up. So this is going to be good. And a career missionary asked a question. He said, if God called me here, and if God knows I'm here, and God wants me here, why do I need prayer? Next question. That's a tough question. I'm not sure at that point that I had really faced that question. I assumed. And my answer wasn't very good. I had a better answer when I researched it a little more. But all I could think to say to him was, well, Paul was a missionary and he needed it, so maybe you can learn from Paul. And that seemed to calm him down. But that's a good question. And I used to turn that question on my seminary students. If God's called you to seminary, and God's called you to ministry, and you're preparing for ministry, and God knows you're here, and God's happy that you're here, why are you taking this course? And I didn't give them a chance to answer, but except in their own minds. One thing I did do on the first day of class, and I'll tell you this, and you can do it if you want to. There's no checks and balances here. I would ask students to write out their definition of prayer and put it in an envelope and seal it. I even handed out envelopes. I was prepared. Write out your definition of prayer, put it in an envelope, seal the envelope, and put it somewhere where you can remember that it's there. because you're going to need, there's outlines on the table there if you don't have an outline. Remember where you put it, because at the end of the semester, I want you to find that envelope. So, if you want to do that, it's good. I don't know when we'll end this. There are a lot of pluses and minuses to being an interim pastor, and the pluses, of course, are the blessings you get and the people you meet from all over the place. One of the negatives is that it sometimes doesn't last very long. Now, exception was just short of a 3-year interim in Lawton, Oklahoma. But most interims, 6 to 9 months, and this one may be even shorter than that because the committee's been working since a year or so ago. So we don't know how far we're going to get into this 2-page outline. But whenever we get to the end, the test for you, not me, I don't need to grade more tests. The test for you would be to get that envelope, don't open it yet, write out your new definition of prayer based on what all has happened in here, and then open the envelope and see if anything happened. It may not. You may have such a good definition of prayer tonight that what happens in here over the Wednesday nights is just to affirm and strengthen your own definition. And on the other hand, maybe it adds something to it. Maybe you get a different slant on prayer or something. So that's for you. If you want to do it, you can do that. So the question is why? And that missionary said, why do I need prayer? So I thought, the best way to start a course on prayer is to start with that why question. Why pray? And I'll give you a really quick Bible study, really, really quick, from John chapter 2. And this is, and I don't think I'll read the whole passage because you're probably pretty familiar with Jesus turning the water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana. So Mary talks to Jesus. Obviously, this is not bow your head, close your eyes kind of talking. But they didn't need that when Jesus was in the room. They just communicated with him. So she is communicating with the Lord, and it's a kind of a loose definition of prayer, but that's what it is. It's communication. And she tells him that they are out of wine, and he commands, you know the story. The water turns to wine. Several things about Mary that we learn about communicating with Jesus. Number one, she went to the right place. When they ran out of wine, she knew exactly where to go to take care of that problem. Effective prayer knows where to go. Another thing about Mary is she knew the right thing to say. All she said to Jesus was, they're out of wine. She didn't tell him what to do. She didn't tell him how to do it. She didn't insist that he do something. She didn't try to motivate him. She just stated, here it is. And again, pretty good lesson on private prayer. When you communicate with the Lord, you don't need to convince him to do something. You don't need to tell him how to do something. You hear people pray that way all the time. Lord, such and such and such. And you said you'd do this in the Bible. Do this. You don't have to tell the Lord how to do things. He knows how. So you just raise the issue, Lord. See, I was praying earlier today. My cousin is in the hospital. He's got COVID. He's a diabetic. And he has some heart issues. It's about all I need to tell the Lord. I think the Lord knows what to do with that. So I don't need to insist that God do something. Mary knew the right place to go, the right thing to say, and nothing more. She didn't need to help him. She did what she could, and then she listened to his response. And the passage indicates that when he said to the servants to get the pitchers and fill them with water, Mary rested. And it leads me to say you have two kinds of prayer rooms. You have a resting place and you have a wrestling place. And there are times when your prayer is kind of wrestling with God. But there are also times when you voice your prayer and you rest. And you rest knowing that God is going to take care of it. So that's one look at the Scripture. Any one of these points, you could go multiple places in Scripture to find backups and stories that would help explain what you're talking about. But why I pray? I've got 4 answers on the outline. The Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. Christian history records it. And our lives require it. So let's go one at a time. The Bible teaches it. All the way from the beginning, you have the first communication between man and God in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. 4th chapter of Genesis, there is more specific kind of prayer communication. And then you get to the 20th chapter of Genesis, and the word prayer actually appears. So early on, you got prayer. All the way through 8th chapter of Revelation, you've got the last mentioning of the word prayer. And in Revelation 22, the last chapter in the Bible, you have the last prayer. And all the way in between, 450 prayers in the Bible, not counting Psalms. You say, why didn't you count Psalms? Because there are probably 450 in the Psalms. The Psalms is a book of prayer. So according to those who counted, I haven't counted, but I'm going to take their word for it. According to those that counted, there are 450 individual prayers in the Bible, not counting the book of Psalms. So Genesis to Revelation, the Bible teaches prayer. The second reason, why? I mean, that would be enough if we just said that the Bible teaches it. You've seen the bumper sticker that says, the Bible teaches it, I believe it, and that settles it. Well, if the Bible teaches it, that settles it. You don't need the middle part of that, whether you believe it or not. The Bible teaches it, that settles it. So the Bible definitely teaches prayer. In addition to that, Jesus modeled it all the way through his life. There are 24 references to Jesus praying, or 24 references to the actual prayer. And I think 21 of those are in the Gospels. There's 1 in Romans and there are 2 in Hebrews. I said actually 3 Sundays ago when I preached on prayer, that was to be the kickoff of this study because we were going from that Sunday right into Wednesday night. We forgot about snow and ice and didn't work out too well. But in that sermon that really launched this study on prayer, I said that the most used verb in the ministry of Jesus was the verb to pray. And I've had students check me out on that, count it themselves. Yeah, you're right. It's not to preach, not to teach, not to heal, not to disciple, it's to pray. It was very much a part of the Lord's life and ministry. His public ministry began in prayer with the baptism, John the Baptist. His earthly ministry ended in prayer on the cross. And again from that sermon, I think I said it in that sermon, the question, what's Jesus doing now? We know what he did. We know what he's going to do. Well, what about today? Well, the writer of Hebrews says he lives, and that's present tense, ongoing, lives. to make intercession for us. So not only did his public ministry emphasize prayer, it still does. He is still praying for us. So the Bible teaches it. Jesus models it. And by the way, if you didn't hear that sermon or don't remember it, the idea was, starting in Luke 5, you have Jesus calling 4 disciples. And then you go from Luke 5 all the way up to Luke 11, and all these things are happening. The casting out of a demon, the raising of a young man who was dead, the healing of a man that was let down through the roof in the house, feeding the multitudes, teaching with parables. All these things happen. And you finally get down to where the disciples can get Jesus alone, and it says they had a question. Lord, teach us to pray. Well, why didn't they ask for something else? Why didn't they say, Lord, if we could raise the dead, we can draw a crowd. And Lord, if you teach us how to feed the hungry, we could start a church. No. It was, Lord, teach us to pray. Not how to pray. They knew how to pray. What they were looking at was a role model. Someone for whom prayer was their very life. So, Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. Let's talk about history. History records it. Oh, you could go any direction here. There's so many great stories. The one I prefer to include at this point is a not so familiar one. It actually started in the 17th century when a prophetic voice made a statement. Whoever will be used in the worthy activity of spreading the evangelical faith must be diligent in all of his doings, and then proceeded to list prayer as the number one doing. Well, that didn't really catch on much, but a few years later, 1727, a Presbyterian minister wrote a book with this title. And remember back then, you don't remember back then, but back then, titles of books were kind of summaries of the whole book. Whereas today, you kind of pick a title that catches somebody's attention, maybe they'll buy it. Well, the title of this book was The History of the Propagation of Christianity and the Overthrow of Paganism. That's a big book, if he covered the whole subject. But Robert Millar, a Presbyterian minister, wrote that book, and he quoted this earlier prophetic voice. And the book sold like crazy. And people read that quote. And they began to realize that if you're advancing the gospel, it advances through prayer. And things begin to happen. There was a group back then called the Moravian Brethren. They're still around. Anybody know any brethren? Not many in this part of the state, but if you went down to central Texas, south of Temple and north of Austin, you get into some Czechoslovakian communities. My wife used to teach at West, not West Texas out there, but West Texas, north of Waco. West is a Czechoslovakian community. That's where you stop and get the kolaches when you're going to Waco. And then you get south of Temple, you get Heidenhammer and Zobjikville and all these Czechoslovakian communities. And they're a part of that Moravian Brethren denomination. But back in the 1700s, you had a small denomination called the Moravians. And one Sunday, in the Moravian church in Herrnhut, Germany, which was West Germany, there wasn't a wall yet, Pastor Roth finished his sermon, and as if empowered by the Spirit, he just fell on his knees beside the pulpit and started praying. Now, they had been praying for some things. There was a guy in that church, a wealthy landowner who was not Czechoslovakian. He owned land in the area, and he let them settle on it. His name was Count Zinzendorf. That's really the only familiar name that anybody has in this whole story. He somehow heard of Count Zinzendorf. He told them he needed them to pray for him because he was trying to teach a class, a Sunday school class of teenage girls, and they were unruly. Can you imagine that some things don't ever change? And so they were already praying for some things, but not anything of global significance necessarily. But Pastor Roth was overcome by his own sermon. He falls on his knees, he begins to pray. People came up and gathered around him, and they prayed, and they kept praying, and they kept praying, and 12 hours later they quit. And they said, this is good. And by the way, they were praying for, quote, the heathen of the world, end quote. That's not a politically correct term anymore. But that's what they were praying, the heathen of the world. They decided that was such a good experience, they needed to duplicate it. So they called for one man, one woman to pray every hour, not all during the hour, but to pray in an hour. And then the next hour, another man and woman would pray until they got 24 hours covered. And they would pray around the clock with one man, one woman. They got the volunteers, and then they got a few more volunteers, and it was more than actually that number. And they started praying, and here's the amazing thing about that prayer meeting. It lasted, according to history, 100 years without interruption. That's a lot of praying. And obviously, some people died along the way, and some others came along, but whatever it was, it's called the hourly intercession. And it was a part of the Moravian Brethren denomination. They still have that. It's not as powerful as it was because, quite frankly, their denomination is not as mission-minded as they were back then. So that is a fact. Now let me personalize it and say when I was interim pastor at First Baptist in Belton, Texas, which is right in the middle of that Czechoslovakian communities, one Sunday, and we were a local access TV. I think that's what they called it back then, which meant we were on TV about as far away as the nursing home. I mean, this wasn't a big deal, but some people could actually hear me preach on TV a few blocks from the church. And one Sunday after I finished, this fellow came up and he introduced himself. He said, I'm pastor of the local Moravian church. Oh, okay. And he said, I've been sick and I haven't been able to preach for several Sundays, so I've been at home watching you on TV. And he said, I'm chairman of the program committee for our state convention, our annual convention, which incidentally met at John Hus Camp, another Czechoslovakian. And he said, you keep talking about missions and evangelism, and we really don't believe in that anymore. Could you come and speak to our state convention? I'm thinking, my kind of crowd, all right. He wants me to speak on something they don't believe. He said, we really need that. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And so I began to research, and I came across this 100-year prayer meeting. And that's what I talked to him about. And I said, this is your history, not mine. This is what happened. Several pastors got up and left while I was talking. You know, they weren't interested in that. But before I finished, a lady got up from back in that part, and she came down and she knelt and started praying. Not loud, just very softly. And I'm still talking. And then another one, and another one. And before I knew it, I had about 20 people kneeling up here praying. And I'm trying to finish, which I did. And they actually invited me to come back for another conference, and I turned them down. I said, you know, I survived one. That's all I need of that. Then we went to Germany on sabbatic leave to teach at the Bible Seminary in Bonn, which is the eastern side of Germany. But before that teaching began, we got to tour. And we met some missionaries, Southern Baptist missionaries. They said, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to Herrnhut. I want to see that Moravian church. Okay? Except for years I had taught this in class as Herrnhut, which I'm hooked on phonics, you see, so that's the way it's spelled, Herrnhut. And when I said that, he said, you mean Herrnhut? No, sure, that's what I meant. Herrnhut. I had a German student who took that class, and I sent him an email after that, and I said, how did you sit through all that and let me make a fool of myself? And he said, well, you never question a professor. Okay. If a professor wants to make a fool of himself, you let him do it. He didn't say that, but that's kind of what he meant. So we went. Now, the problem was the Moravian church at Herrnhut had burned down long time ago. In fact, that prayer meeting wasn't in the church in Herrnhut. It was in Bertelsdorf, in the Lutheran church, where they were borrowing the Lutheran church to meet in because their church burned down. So I'm learning all kinds of things now. So let's go find that Lutheran church in Bertelsdorf. We found it. As we were walking around, a lady came out of the house next door. That was the parsonage, or the manse, I think they call it, to see what we wanted. She turns out to be the wife of the rector, I think is how they called him. And I told her, she said, well, let me unlock the door and let you in. I went in. Somewhere I've got a picture. And I knelt beside the same pulpit that Pastor Roth had knelt by to start that 100-year prayer meeting. Now, I didn't start a 100-year prayer meeting, but it was quite an experience for me. But as I researched all that, I said, I wonder what actually happened during the 100 years. You got this small denomination of Moravians praying. What happened as they prayed? Well, the first thing I found was that they started sending missionaries. They're in a church meeting and somebody, whoever the pastor was, said, is anybody feeling a call to take the gospel to the heathen? And Conrad Dobler raised his hand and said, God has called me to go to the Virgin Islands. And the pastor said, as soon as God calls somebody else to go with you, we'll send two. And another young man stood up and said, that's me. That was the beginning. In the next 25 years, the Moravians started more churches than all of Christianity started in the previous 200 years. They went all over Europe, Africa, North America, Asia, starting churches. Because they believed that's what you do. So I'm still thinking, what else? I mean, you would expect something to come from within, but what else happened during that 100-year period? Here's a list of some of them. And by the way, the second group of missionaries they sent out packed all of their belongings in their caskets. There was no sense of, when do we get to come home? When's our stateside assignment? When's our furlough? They went to stay and to be buried in whatever country they went to. 1734. Now remember, all this started in 1727. 1734, you have the First Great Awakening. Did that have anything to do with a small group of Moravians praying for the heathen of the world? I think so. I don't think I can prove that, but a lot of things about prayer that you can't prove in ways that we like proof. But knowing what I think I know about God and how he works, I can see God responding to a group of Moravians, and a big awakening takes place in the world. 1724. 1738, John Wesley's converted. Well, if you've been around church very long, you've heard the name John Wesley. Not as much in Baptist churches as Methodists, but we sing his songs and quote him. You know where he was converted? At a Moravian prayer meeting. John Wesley. 1739, you have the great Methodist revivals in Oxford. 1792, Second Great Awakening. 1857, the Great Prayer Revival. Probably leaving out some things. I'm skipping around my notes here. I missed 1739, First Methodist Society, Great Revivals in Oxford. I mentioned that. 1747 is the one I missed. The Christians in Boston entered into a 7-year concert of prayer. And you have revival sweeping up and down the eastern seaboard. 1783, a call went out for all Baptist churches to set aside the first Monday of each month for united intercession for the heathen of the world. Then you have Second Great Awakening. Same year as the Second Great Awakening, William Carey sailed for India under the Baptist Missionary Society. He felt God's calling him to go to India by reading a newspaper called the Periodical Accounts, published by the Moravians. He took it with him when he went to the board meeting, and the board members of the Baptist Missionary Society said, you can't go to India. If God wants people in India saved, he'll do it without you. And as the story goes, William Carey took out that newspaper and threw it, literally, at the board members and said, if the Moravians can do it, why can't the Baptists do it? And the stories that accompany William Carey's ministry in India are rampant. 1806, missions crossed the Atlantic, landed at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. I bet some of you, somewhere along the way in some kind of children's missions group or vacation Bible school or something, heard the term haystack prayer meeting. That's when it happened. And it was a group of students at Williams College who got caught in a hailstorm and dove under a haystack and prayed for their lives. And they said to God, if you'll get us safely out of this hailstorm, we'll go anywhere you want us to go in the world. And that was the beginning of the modern missionary movement from within the United States. Haystack prayer meeting. Later in that century, Hudson Taylor, China Inland Mission. Hudson Taylor was the father of faith missions. 50 years. During the time, they said the sun never rose in China without finding Hudson Taylor on his knees. The Canadian Baptist Missionary Society decided to send Jonathan Goforth into North China to start missions. And Hudson Taylor wrote him a letter, and he said, brother, if you would enter that province, you must go forward on your knees. So that gets us through that 100 years. And just outside of that 100 years comes the great prayer revival of 1857, which I'll talk about later some Wednesday night. This was New York City, 500,000 people saved in the United States as a result of a prayer meeting of 7 men who prayed. I don't know if they were praying for the heathen of the world, but similar terminology. Did any of that have to do with these Moravians who were praying? I think so. I think God honored the faithfulness of that group of Moravians and the vision they had of sending missionaries to the world. I think God honored that. And I don't think it's any mistakes that these kinds of events happened during the 100 years when the Moravians were praying. Now, to go back to John Huth's camp down near Brenham, Texas, I finished my speech with these ladies praying at the altar. by saying, that's your history, it's not mine. But would you pray for my denomination? Because we have the power and the money and the people to do what you did. And I sat down. And several more preachers got up and left. Anyway, you live and learn. I've declined the second invitation. So go with what I did. Now, there's one more point there. Let me stop and see if you have any questions, or if anybody has texted you a question, or if I've got any questions. Anybody? Can we get a copy of the outline? No. Pray for Tiger Woods. No. I know who those are from. I don't know who the third one. Third one said, how did you get so interested in prayer? Well, we'll see if I have time to do that at the end. Questions? None? The fourth reason, you said the Bible teaches it. We're talking about why should we pray. The Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. History records it. And there are numerous other illustrations I could give you on history recording it. But usually I find that people aren't as familiar with that one. And so it's of interest, whereas some others that we've talked about from time to time may not be as interesting anymore. So the fourth one is our lives require a prayer relationship with God. Why do I say that? Because it's the nature of that relationship. Our relationship with God is a love relationship. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. I preached a couple of Sundays ago on Perspectives on Love. That was the one I zoomed. And I zoomed it on Saturday and they plugged it in on Sunday. Perspectives on love. God loves us. We love God. Therefore, we ought to love each other. But it's that God loving us part that connects us to prayer. I'd say to my seminary students, everything you do in ministry that's worth anything comes from God. So if you don't know how to communicate with God, how are you going to be worth anything? And then they just stare at me like you're doing. Eyes get big. So I would paraphrase that or would adapt it to you, because you're not seminary students. Everything you do of significance for God, in your family, in your job, in your church, comes from God. So if you don't know how to communicate with God properly, how do you expect to do all these godly things? So it's the nature of our relationship. It's a love relationship. Love relationships demand communication. And we can do that so easy these days. We get to FaceTime with our great-grandson. He'll be 2 years old next month, so he doesn't say much that we can understand. But it's communication. Couldn't do that 10 years ago. In fact, I determined early on, when it appeared I was going to be doing a considerable amount of global travel, that I would make an attempt to call home every day, at least every 24-hour period. And I think I did a pretty good job of fulfilling that. And I have called home from some strange places. Red Square in Moscow. Called home to tell my wife I was in line at McDonald's. McDonald's? Yeah, they've got a McDonald's in Red Square. The menu's in Russian, but you kind of know what it is anyway if you've been to McDonald's. Dakar, Senegal. Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Called home. That's where I was meeting with those missionaries, where the first one raised his hand and asked that question. So I wanted to call home, so they said, well, there's a pay phone booth downtown. We'll take you down there. pay phone booth, get in, get an international operator on the phone. While I'm trying to connect with my wife in Fort Worth, a guy goes by on a bicycle, and he's wearing a T-shirt. It says, "Beautiful downtown Ouagadougou." And about that time, my wife says, "Hello, where are you?" I said, "I'm in beautiful downtown Ouagadougou." And I got to have that T-shirt. So we went on a search to find where I could buy that T-shirt. I mean, when you have called home from beautiful downtown Ouagadougou, it means you're pretty serious about communicating. Now, why would I do that? Why would I go to the trouble to get somebody to take me downtown to get an international operator to call home from a place I'd never heard of before? Because of the relationship. Now, our daughter went through her teenage years like most teenage girls do, with a few problems. Not serious problems, but teenage girl problems. I didn't mind her going to counselors. The only thing I hated is when the counselors called the whole family in. I hated those meetings. So we're sitting in there, and the counselor says, "I understand you call home from all over the world." "Yes, sir." "Why do you do that?" I said, "Well, because I want to talk to my family." "Are you sure it's not because you're checking on your family?" So now I'm beginning to hear what my daughter's telling him, her version of this. I said, "So are you trying to prove codependency here?" And he said, "Well, we're getting towards it." And I said, "Well, I'm codependent with God. And because I love God, I love my family. And I want to talk to them." "Well," he says, "I think that's pretty strange." I said, "I think you're right, but I'll keep doing it." So he didn't get very far with that conversation, but we paid him anyway. See, prayer is not a legalistic thing. Jesus never required people to pray. He never even demanded that people pray. He only taught it when he was asked to. He modeled it. So it's the nature of our relationship. It's the purpose of our relationship. Not, as one man said, not seeking what's in God's hands, but seeking God's face. Back to that illustration of Mary at the wedding feast. Not telling God what to do. I've been in some strange prayer meetings. I have heard people tell God what to do in no uncertain terms, and then command Satan what to do. I said, "Why are you talking to Satan? You're talking to God. He's more powerful. Why don't you switch off and talk to Satan? He's nothing. Let God take care of Satan." But I don't know why people want to tell God what to do and when to do it and how to do it, and because you said you'd do this. Not the nature of prayer. So why do missionaries need prayer? Yep. A little better answer than I had that day in Burkina Faso. The Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. History records it. Our lives require it. And just because you're a missionary doesn't exempt you. In fact, you probably need it more than the rest of us. So I don't know how you can apply that, because we're not a room full of missionaries tonight, but that's why. Now, somebody sent me a text. I heard it ding. But the earlier one was, how'd you get so interested in prayer? Well, you'd be glad to know. Willie Woo is online. Willie, from Austin. Sharon Grisham. Anybody know Sharon? She's from Burleson. Goes to Hallsbury. Is that right? Hallsbury Baptist. Hi, Sharon. And I don't know who asked me about how I got interested in prayer. I used to get asked that sometimes, because the truth is, women are usually a lot more interested in prayer than men. Is that true? 7-3. And if you think somebody's so interested in prayer that they're teaching prayer in a seminary, it must be a woman. So how'd you get so interested? A woman, my mother. My mother was a prayer warrior. I mean, if God had owned a refrigerator, my mother's picture would have been on it. I mean, she was in God, she had God on speed control, speed dial, yeah. And they were on first name basis. She just talked to God all the time. And she'd always been that way, but she intensified it. The last 12 years of her life, she was homebound, and basically what she did was pray. She took the church pictorial directory and she would start through with A and pray. And when she found somebody that she thought really needed prayer, she'd call them on the phone and pray with them over the phone. And then she'd go back till she got to Z, and then she'd start over. Just praying for church members. Most of them didn't even know her because she had been homebound for so long. She was a prayer warrior. My dad was the pastor, so I'd heard him pray and seen what happened when he prayed. But all of that didn't really formulate it in my life until I was 15 years old, and I'm going to do this in 2 minutes. 15 years old, and I was in a car wreck, broke the second vertebrae of my neck, wasn't supposed to live, supposed to have been paralyzed if I lived. I wasn't paralyzed and I wasn't dead. And 9 months in and out of a hospital bed, surgery scheduled twice, canceled both times. And people prayed for me that I still meet to this day. My dad was pastor in Houston. My mother was the president of the Pastors' Wives organization among Baptist churches in Houston. And they organized that group of praying women, and they prayed for me. They prayed me out of both those surgeries. My surgeon was an atheist, but he was the best surgeon in the southern part of the United States, they said. Howard Duff. The last visit we had with him, 9 months after the automobile accident, my dad was thanking him, and he said, "You don't have to thank me." He said, "I didn't do anything." And my dad said, "Well, we know you did. You're being humble." He said, no, somebody other than me took care of this." Now, that's as close as he ever came to denouncing his atheism, but it was pretty close. And I lived through that because people prayed me through it. I mean, I'm totally convinced that's the only reason I came through it without being paralyzed. You don't break the second vertebrae of the neck without paralysis or death. Even today, that's the wrong vertebrae to break if you're going to break one. So I learned in that experience, as one person told me, flat on your back, you had no way to look but up. Mm-hmm. But I learned in that experience the value of prayer and the power of prayer. And, it made me a praying person. And then I get in a faculty meeting and ask a question, and I end up teaching prayer, occupying what we thought was the only fully endowed chair of prayer in the world, until I met the guy from Asbury Seminary who occupied the chair of prayer at Asbury Seminary. So there are two, and now we're back to one. It's at Asbury. So that was an honor, but it was an honor based on a bunch of praying women, including my mother. So that's how I got interested in prayer. Questions? See you next Wednesday. Thank you, online participants. You know what I forgot? Leave that on. Just 30 more seconds. It's a little book I found called Build at a New Gate. I don't know how they got that title, but it wasn't in the 17th century, that's for sure. An Irreverent Guide to Churchology. It says, I cannot tell you how to pray. It would have taken you 3 or 4 or maybe 5 minutes to read a chapter on prayer. I'm very serious when I tell you this. Take the time you would have taken to read a chapter on prayer and go pray. It'll do you more good.